Hello and welcome back to another episode of PS4 Horror Spotlight. This week we're looking at The Evil Within. The Evil Within is the most recent release from legendary game designer Shinji Mikami. Since you're watching a series on horror video games, I should expect you to know that name already, but on the off chance that you don't, he's the creator of Resident Evil, the very game that first coined the term survival horror. Though Mikami didn't invent the style of survival horror that we now know today, consisting of fear-inducing atmosphere punctuated by skin-of-the-teeth resource management, he can comfortably be solely credited with popularizing it, especially for console markets. If not for Shinji Mikami, my own personal favorite horror series, the original Team Silent Hill games, would not have been created to cash in on the survival horror boom started by Shinji Mikami, and considering the snowball effect that Silent Hill 2 has had on other horror games that continues today, it almost feels wrong for me to criticize Mikami for anything, since his impact on the industry has been so massive and all important to the development of my own personal tastes. So let's begin by ripping the band-aid right off. Shinji Mikami has made some shitty games and has even created adverse effects on the horror genre as a whole. In your narrator's honest and humble opinion, it was his design of Resident Evil 4 that largely led to the long dormancy of the horror genre between 2005 and 2010. No, I am certainly not accusing Resident Evil 4 of being a bad game, but rather a false prophet. It was a bombastic, campy action game with horror elements sprinkled in, but its ties to the Resident Evil series somehow convinced everyone on Earth that it was the redefinition of the entire horror genre. It's easy to see why, since Resident Evil 4 was a perfect game in just about every way, and while it had its jump scares and macabre imagery, it also managed to school action games with a concept so simple it made every other action game developer feel foolish for not thinking of it first. So action games adopted Resident Evil 4's style and refined it, and after Resident Evil 4, hardly any pure horror games were ever allowed to penetrate the market that the big publishers had such a firm stranglehold over. Even the Resident Evil series itself, which continued after Mikami's departure from Capcom, mirrored the trending direction of the AAA publishers' claims that horror games were dead, and that people were only willing to spend money on twitchy action games, and they all needed to be focus tested to death by bloodthirsty 13-year-olds that wanted everything to be more like Call of Duty, except they didn't want to buy anything like Call of Duty because it didn't bear the Call of Duty name. They just wanted to focus test the next Call of Duty. Notice that every series that tried to be like Call of Duty was failing miserably, by simple virtue of the fact that it wasn't called Call of Duty. While horror games were declared dead by out-of-touch publishers waiting to explode with the inevitable zeitgeist of amnesia, Shinji Mikami actually did contribute to the horror genre. Granted, it was a horror comedy written by none other than Suda51, and its gameplay was largely focused on action over tension, but horror comedy is still a valid subgenre of horror and an aspect of Resident Evil 4 that was largely praised by critics and fans, and holy shit did I absolutely adore Shadows of the Damned. But Mikami wasn't satisfied with the action-oriented direction of the market he'd inadvertently helped create, and in 2014 he was ready to return to his roots with his first entry into tight-lipped, serious survival horror since he directed the Resident Evil remake back in 2002. The result of this passion project was The Evil Within. I was initially turned off to The Evil Within when I first saw the gameplay trailers. It looked like Outlast with a third-person perspective and about a tenth of the subtlety, and I consider lack of subtlety to be one of Outlast's biggest faults to begin with. But no, I thought, eyes forward, this is Shinji Mikami. Subtlety is not his strong suit. Where Mikami is usually most successful is in creating memorable environments filled with outlandish occurrences. A chainsaw-wielding psychopath with an elaborate spinning blade trap is trademark Mikami. Roll with it. So I did, and I eventually managed to find some enjoyment in The Evil Within. Eventually. The main problem lies in the game's story. It's pure chaos. I understand the temptation developers often have to design environments first and then build the story around as a sort of adhesive to tie everything together, but The Evil Within takes things a few steps too far. The seams are too obvious in this case. You escape the bloodbath at the mental hospital, the city is suddenly destroyed, you wake up in the woods, now you're in a church, now you're in an ancient catacomb, then you're in a creepy house, then back to the streets of the ruined city, but so much of it without the environment seeming to connect, and the vast majority of it without an endgame on the horizon. A poorly sutured, hobbling Frankenstein made of all left limbs and a confused facial expression, with no torso to hold everything together. For the most part, you're simply following your friends down the rabbit hole, with the characters being just as confused as you are as to why everything has gone tits up. I kept asking, What is the plan? Are we trying to escape? Are we trying to return things to the way they were? Are we trying to learn the truth? But the game simply kept insisting that I follow the linear path and refused to give me a singular goal outside my immediate vicinity. The environment design plays out like Super Mario 3, with one themed level leading into a totally different themed level without more than the laziest transition. It makes me think back to other Shinji Mikami games and how their goals were laid out. Resident Evil, escape the mansion. Resident Evil 4, save the president's daughter and escape the village. Shadows of the Damned, save your girlfriend and escape hell. The Evil Within, find your friends and maybe you'll figure it out from there. It all ultimately does make sense, but not in a particularly satisfying way, and certainly not in a way that excuses the nearly 3/4 of the 16 hours of gameplay I spent not knowing my character's goal. The explanation is that everything takes place within a shared consciousness, so the resulting random stuff that happens from different people's memories comes off as a full-blown contrivance for linking so many disparate locations together. It's as if the idea of the game was conceived from the concept art and not the other way around. If The Evil Within were a painting, it would be one thing, but it's a 16-hour video game, and a frustrating one at that. We'll get to that soon enough. All would be forgiven if the characters themselves were interesting, but they're nothing but flat caricatures. The protagonist, Detective Sebastian Castellanos, delivers all of his motives and backstory and exposition through journals found outside of save rooms, and none of it is relevant to the main plot whatsoever. It's not even mentioned in dialogue, except one time where his partner mentions his drinking problem. One would think this tragic past would become part of the plot, but it never does, which feels like a huge missed opportunity, since we're supposed to be living inside his shared consciousness as well. The only character that comes remotely close to being interesting is the antagonist, who does have a few sympathetic moments, but ultimately falls into the same trap of having his most important material told to us and not shown. The sugar-free icing on the vanilla cake here is that, unlike almost every other game I've ever played by Shinji Mikami, The Evil Within is bone dry and totally lacking a sense of humor. It's over the top, but in a Michael Bay sort of way, not Mikami's usual possibly intentional hilarity. True, the Resident Evil remake didn't have much in the way of humor either, but it was built on rock-solid foundations of environment and threat design, mostly likable characters, and a huge variety of memorable encounters. And while it didn't come off as funny, it also didn't come off as taking itself too seriously. The Evil Within, on the other hand, begs to be considered art of the highest order, but its lack of character and consistency gives it no leg to stand on. With all that negativity out of the way, there's a lot of good to be found in the moment-to-moment gameplay, so long as you choose to ignore the forest for the trees. I've heard critical praise declaring that The Evil Within is what Resident Evil 5 should have been, and I actually agree. If The Evil Within took all of its set pieces and built them into the Resident Evil universe, it may well have been a worthy follow-up to Resident Evil 4, and as it stands, again from a gameplay perspective, it's a worthy spiritual successor. The controls build on the style started in Resident Evil 4 and greatly improved in Shadows of the Damned, and while they're not perfect, they're more than serviceable. Conventional weapons, aside from the depressingly useless melee attack, feel potent and reward accuracy, as the starting pistol can bring down the average enemy with a pair of headshots. The shotgun packs a powerful punch capable of sending enemies flying, and the long-range rifle insta-kills just about everything that isn't a boss. One weapon I thought I would hate was the Agony crossbow, or the Angst bow as I prefer to call it, with its complex system of do-it-yourself ammo crafting. While switching between different types of ammo is a bit clunky, the crossbow turned out to be a godsend during many of the boss fights, allowing me to bring down seemingly impossible foes with creative combinations and traps. There were times when I was reminded of some of the best moments of Resident Evil 4, and the various ways to use the crossbow's different ammo types felt like a new layer of evolution. That said, the difficulty is ramped up to ludicrous levels of excess compared to Resident Evil 4. Imagine playing Resident Evil 4 with about 1/10 of the ammunition. You'll understand the staggering levels of frustration I faced. The game gives you a few stealth mechanics you can use to conserve ammo in the slower, more horror-esque portions, but there are more than a few grandiose action set pieces that force you to kill every enemy in the area before you can proceed, and if you run out of ammo, you're screwed. Sure, you get a silly melee attack, but it does almost no damage, even after you've spent all the possible skill points on it. These set pieces often precede boss fights as well, although the game mercifully allows you to bypass some of the bosses without actually fighting, a choice-based mechanic I quite liked actually. Nonetheless, I wasn't about to slog through this insanely long, meandering game via trial and error, so I eventually dropped the difficulty down from normal to casual, which made the experience feel only a bit more challenging than the average game. And it was after that switch that I actually started to have fun with it. It's not that I don't like a challenge, hell, I'll heap endless praise on games like The Binding of Isaac and Dark Souls because of their insane difficulty. But for a game to have this kind of challenge, the mechanics have to be perfect. And in the case of The Evil Within, they're not. Sometimes I'll try to execute a melee attack, but instead I'll shoot from the hip, a mechanic that doesn't even exist naturally within the game. A lot of the enemies in the later parts of the game have guns, and you're just not fast enough to deal with them effectively, and holy shit, that frame rate sometimes drops to what feels like 5 frames per second, making it feel horribly optimized for the PS4. The Evil Within turned out to be fairly enjoyable, or at least better than I'd expected, but I found it too long, too difficult, and too uninteresting for me to ever want to replay it. For its initial retail price of $60, I'd have said to wait for a massive price drop. It's currently available on the PlayStation Store with all of its DLC included for $30, but I'm not sure I can recommend it even at that price. Having played the main game, I don't have any interest in playing the DLC, but if the price were to drop to $20, even for just the base game, I would probably change my tune. You'll certainly be able to sink a ton of time into it, but for me, it didn't quite feel like time well spent. This has been the Panic Reroll with another episode of PS4 Horror Spotlight, a series dedicated to console devotees wondering whether or not a given horror game is worth the asking price. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.